Hello listeners, I am your speaker Casey, and as many of you may know, I am currently undertaking the Psychology of Coercive Control Master's course at Salford University. I hope that this course will make me more informed and better equipped for future projects and interviews on the podcast. In the meantime, I will be releasing renewed versions of older episodes with updates from previous guests. If you want to find out what I remember from the time of each interview and get in-depth updates from the guests, I've been writing blog posts as I go through older episodes and adding them to my website, cultvaultpodcast.com, which you can also find links to in the episode description. You can find links on my website for support on navigating recovery from cultic abuse, to learn more about how to help a loved one, or become more informed about the subject of cults and coercive control. My emails are still open, and I am carefully curating a list of guests to speak with once I am back to interviewing officially next year. You can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to get in touch. And now, on to today's updated episode.
If you would have gone to a typical college, not affiliated with a religion or faith, and had a similar experience to that outside of the Church of Christ, would that have been thrown back at you like, we told you this would happen?
No, my parents didn't prepare me at all. I have no idea why they let me even go to that school. My parents grew up during Jim Crow, and they were teenagers during the Civil Rights Movement. And so I know they know what this country is like. And truth be told, that town felt like stepping back into the 1960s. This was the early 2000s, but, you know, I had experienced bias and racism before in more like covert ways, like in the church that I grew up in, where they were just like, Black culture is sinful, you know, or like, they wouldn't say Black culture, but they would like name things that were Black culture, but like never that level of just like overt racism. I even, you know, in the town around the school experienced being denied service at restaurants that were like walking distance from the campus. Yeah, it was horrible. So I had a horrific, traumatizing experience. And that, I think, more than anything was, you know, I mentioned the things about the doctrine, people not following the doctrine, but when I left the Church of Christ officially and stopped going, it was after being at that school and realizing like I'm not actually welcome in most churches of Christ. And the churches of Christ where I grew up, where people are all worshiping together, is not normal. That's not what happens in 99% of the churches. And so the experience I actually had in Tennessee was the normal experience that I would have as a Black person attending churches that were not exclusively Black churches.
It's despicable on so many levels.
It never occurred to me. I just went wherever my friends went. And I'll share one more story. This is actually about the school. While I was there, I've heard that this has changed since I left, but while I was there, this would have been in the early 2000s, they did not celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which in the United States is a federal holiday where all public offices, banks, post office, everything is closed. And schools are closed. And so I remember being in school there, and they just treated it like almost like any other day. They would have like some sort of sanitized, abbreviated version of like the I Have a Dream speech, and ask like a Black male, one of maybe the 5 who went to the school, to like read part of that in chapel. And that was the only acknowledgement. We still had class. And I've never heard of a school not honoring a federal holiday. It was mind-blowing, and that had probably been going on for decades at that school. And when I asked about it to somebody who was a prominent member of the Church of Christ in Alabama, who had generationally gone to that school, so that person was my parents' age, but she had gone to that school, her children went to the school, her parents had gone to the school. She said to me that she didn't even know why there was a Martin Luther King Jr. Day holiday. This is a white woman from Alabama in the Church of Christ. that all she knows is that he cheated on his wife, and she doesn't know why we would celebrate someone like that.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
The thing about the entire situation is that it almost comes back to what we were talking about at the start of the episode, where your closeness to God is it's almost conditional, and in this situation it's conditional on the color of your skin.
Right. Well, I mean, according to the Church of Christ, God created everyone, and if God created everyone, then that means that God created everyone of all the races, of all the genders, of all, and I feel like it was abundantly clear, especially after I went to Frieda Hardeman, that to be righteous was to be white. And so it wasn't, it's not even, I mean, at this point, I'm like, I shouldn't have needed to like want to change myself, but it really, I don't know, there's such an incongruence. For me, those sorts of things were things that made me have more questions and made me doubt, because I was like, well, this seems wrong. Like, I'm pretty sure I tend to be more of an independent thinker, and not to always, don't always just take what I'm told. I process it and question it. And I was like, I'm pretty sure that this is not like, I'm pretty sure that that racism is like evil. And I'm pretty sure that enslavement was evil. And I'm pretty sure that the discrimination and brutality that Black people and other people of color, and particularly Indigenous First Nations people, experienced in the United States was evil. And like, the Church of Christ doesn't have any official, even though it started in the 1800s in the United States, in the South, in Tennessee and Kentucky, they don't have any official teachings about enslavement being wrong, about racism or anything like that. And so my assumption is that the churches were always segregated from the very beginning, and that if there were enslaved people that were converted in the Church of Christ, that they were a part of their own congregations from the time that the Church of Christ started up until the present day. And I even remember asking some people, I don't know if it was like a faculty at the school or somebody, maybe peers, like, if the worldly people, like the United States government, which aren't even Christians, if they could say that discrimination is wrong and there could be an entire civil rights movement where they tell everyone you have to integrate because this is wrong for you to be separated,
yep,
then how is the Church of Christ still segregated? And that's okay. Like, wouldn't we be like behind, where aren't we supposed to be more righteous than these people who are worldly? And so those sorts of things made me have more questions, made me doubt. And I think the racism was one of the biggest leaps of like doubts that I had, as far as like Church of Christ, and eventually it just Christianity in general, because those sorts of things are not unique to the Church of Christ. The Church of Christ is very, that's pretty run of the mill as far as like evangelical Christianity goes. And so it even though they claim to be like the one true church, the similarity that they have to like every other Southern evangelical church tradition is so similar that in things like racism, that it makes it hard to tell the difference, to be honest.
And we haven't even touched on the misogyny that you wrote about in your emails to me, and the difference between how men and women are treated in the church itself. And I feel like that's such an important and prevalent thing to discuss. But because we've never had the option to discuss race at length in terms of some of these Southern American congregations, it's almost like it's less of a prevalent thing because the racism is so obvious and so toxic and humiliating for you to go through that experience, but also the spiritual abuse as well that comes from being born into the church and then basically being told that you're born into this church, but you can't really ever be a full member of the faith because of the skin color that you're born with, even though we want you to read this Bible and take the messages from it that we don't actually believe in or align ourselves with. That's such a horrific thing to go through. And then, of course, growing up as a person who was assigned female at birth, going through all of those things that probably didn't make sense to you as an independent thinker and somebody who wants to have individualism, but also then your journey into realizing that perhaps you don't identify with your assigned gender, and then having all of those difficult conversations with yourself on top of all of the stuff that comes with the introverted and extroverted types of racism that you're exposed to.
Right. And one thing I do want to say, because I thank you for mentioning that you hadn't had an opportunity to like discuss race at length, because my experience has been after leaving, and even in the past like couple of years that I've been connected with cult survivor communities, is that there isn't really a discussion of the experience that survivors of color have within the cult survivor community either, and like discussions of like race in our like survivor spaces and the unique struggle that people experience as survivors of color who leave these groups into a world that is dangerous, that is hostile, and that will not have sympathy for you as an uneducated person of color, as somebody who doesn't have the social and emotional skills, as someone who's traumatized. And it is really, I feel so passionately about it because of my experience. Like I have experienced being homeless, for 2.5 years and relatively recently. And part of that is because I would go to work and experience racism. So I'm not in the church. This is just like out in the community, I would experience housing discrimination, and no one prepared me for this in the group. No one taught me about how to navigate that. And on top of that, because I've left this group and my entire family and social network, I have no social support system anymore. And so that is a factor in people experiencing severe depression and being suicidal and like, going back even because they get out and they're trying to like live their lives and it's too hard. And it turns out that some of the things that this group has told us about the world being evil and dangerous is actually true for people of color in a way that it's not true for survivors that aren't people of color. And so I'm actually going to be speaking about that and more like at greater length at the International Cultic Studies Association conference this year. I am going to have a session on like race and the experience of survivors of color in the cultic community, because I am, I'm an activist in any situation that I find myself in, any environment. And I'm always like, how do we make this better? How do we make it more inclusive? And how do we tend to and support and elevate and amplify the voices and experiences of people who are the most marginalized in any group? And I notice like in a lot of the literature, and a lot of the documentaries that are done about cult survivors, there's very few Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And these are people who are targeted by these groups because they're already disenfranchised from the larger society. And I understand why my parents thought that it was a good idea to raise us in this group. Do I agree? Absolutely not. But I also have the benefit of retrospect of having grown up in this group, and my parents joined around when they were my age, and having lived in the civil rights movement and like witnessing what was happening in the United States in the previous like 3 decades, I can understand their thought process of thinking like raising us in this church where people are worshiping together, where they had actually a significant amount of support as parents for all of the harm that they cause, which I do feel like the harm outweighed the benefits. But as people going in and having no experience, not having lived, in the group for as long as they have now, and not having the experience of being born and raised in the group, I could imagine why they would have thought it was a good idea. And I think that I just feel very strongly about like naming that and naming that I think cult survivors are in a unique position as people who know what it's like to be othered, as people who know what it's like to other, as people who have had to reconstruct and deconstruct our entire worldview, that we are in a unique position to even address things like racism among ourselves, because like even more than the general population, I think, because we have practice at doing the things that need to be done in order to change these sorts of things. And so it's just something I feel really strongly about, and it's something that I want to just name and lift up.
There sounds like there is definitely a gap and a need for more research and resources for cult survivors that are also people of color. From what you said there, it sounds like there's a big gap and a lot of information missing. And I think it's so fantastic that you are applying yourself to that, to provide that research and those resources for people. To speak at an ICSA conference is not a small thing. So, to have the courage to do that on top of everything that you've already told us that you've done is such a huge thing. And I have no doubts that we will see your name on the tops of research papers and maybe even books and just a huge researched resources that will be a huge help for cult survivors and for people of color, and both communities combined. I think that's such a fantastic thing that you're working towards. And you mentioned that actually, interestingly, you've already been involved with the publication of a book, and I didn't know if you wanted to just mention that kind of little side story.
Yeah, that book, yesterday I was thinking about just like reflecting on this, and I realized that when that book was published, the book is called Girl to Girl, and I was involved in writing it when I was 16, and I think it was published when I was 18. It basically is a cookbook of like all of like purity culture and toxic like legalism, specifically toxic misogyny for adolescents who are assigned female in the group. And in retrospect, it's incredibly toxic, and I don't agree with any of it now. But to be honest, that book being published and these sorts of like other performances of piety were the only times that I experienced my parents expressing that they were proud of me. And so on some level, I felt pushed towards doing those things and to do things like speaking on ladies' conferences and that sort of thing, even though I didn't even necessarily like agree with all of it, because that was how I could get like attention and validation. And I think that is really unhealthy and probably was like a trauma experience that I like even now I feel I'm just noticing that it's like my energy has dropped thinking about that. because I, of course, like any child, I wanted my parents to be proud of me. And for me, it wasn't really academics or, even as an adult, like a job or any kind of outside acclaim that I could get. The only things that really would make them proud of me is me being seen as a performance or achieving things within the Church of Christ, because that group is so insular. And people do kind of become like Church of Christ famous, if you've written books and that sort of thing.
And that book is still available for purchase today.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
But it doesn't have your actual name. It's a pen name or a pseudonym that's attached to the book.
No, so that's when I came out as non-binary, I changed my name, and so that book is under like what was my legal name.
Right.
So I'm kind of glad about that, and also it has like my picture and stuff on it. And it's interesting that book, one of the chapters, it wasn't the chapter that I wrote, but one of the chapters was based on a survey that were done of boys or guys, I guess, at Fried Hardeman, where asking them to name the articles of clothing or types of clothing that they felt were immodest or that would cause them to lust. And basically even in the book, we're like indoctrinating other teens and young adults to submit to the male gaze and to let them tell us what we are allowed to wear. What ended up happening was that basically every article of clothing that anyone could possibly wear was named. And so it really showcased how there was no way to act. Like, it's totally normal to have sexual thoughts when you're looking at other people, and you're like, I probably at any age, but particularly as a teenager, like a young adult, but it pathologized it. And for me, that I did honestly feel creeped out. I'm surprised that more people didn't feel creeped out. I remember it being like, wow, we've gotten so enlightened by this information that they shared with us. But because of that type of environment, I had completely suppressed my suppressed. I'm not sure which one of those is the correct word, but push down any desire. I lived and identified as asexual for the first 29 years of my life, because I knew that all of it was like those things are so demonized. Like, purity culture was such a big part of growing up in the Church of Christ that it kind of felt like, I think on a subconscious level, that I should never, ever experience attraction to anyone.
Just in case you do anything wrong, it's best to just not do anything at all, ever.
Yeah, and you can't just turn that off. I know other people who have even gotten married and had trouble, having really messed up views of sexuality and gender because of how we were taught to think about those things. And that book contributed to that, for sure.
Well, I saw a post on Reddit the other day. I've mentioned this in a previous interview, but that it was a post on r/ex-Christian, and it said, does anybody else struggle with fetishes because of the purity culture that they grew up with? And the thread was both men and women. Well, I imagine it was all people. The thread was all people discussing fetishes that they have grown. I don't know what the right word would be.
Yeah, developed, or
fetishes that they have developed around purity culture, which basically just meant that they became attracted to hair of a certain length or skirts of a certain length. So if the women could only wear skirts below the knee, that then became attractive and fetishized by some of the people in the church and the congregations that these Redditors were speaking from. So it, and when you mentioned the male gaze there, you know, women's mouths and lips are so over sexualized in TV, film, media, that then in everyday life, even when people are just having conversations with women who aren't wearing lipstick or doing anything to obviously overemphasize those features, does that then not just necessarily mean that women's mouths are then sexy anyway? So how do you can't just not have a mouth. So how do you get away from that side of the male gaze? I saw another thing yesterday, and I'm probably going to mess up the wording, but it was something like purity culture has taught us that women, like, no matter what we do, how we dress or anything, we are the problem because men are attracted to us. Yes, however, in any way. And of course, this is just looking at the very simplistic, a man and a woman marry and then they will have sex in their marital bed. We're not even talking about any of the LGBTQIA plus community, or how a person might not feel that they identify with their assigned gender from birth, how a person might be attracted to multiple people of multiple genders for different reasons. This is literally just talking about how men may still be attracted to women no matter how they look or dress or talk or act, because men are just attracted to things like that. Right. That's human nature, isn't it? Like that is just so that's without even touching on the LGBTQIA plus community, which I feel is still an important thing to touch on. So what, and I suppose the answer to this at this point is probably obvious, but what are the views, thoughts and feelings around that particular community group in the Church of Christ?
Yeah, so I would just say in a simple way that it being anything other than cisgender, heterosexual is a one-way ticket to hell. Like, that's the most succinct way that I can put it. I have heard in sermons in the Church of Christ, people compare, first of all, they talk about homosexuality, using that word, all the time. Every single sermon, every time. And it is compared to being a murderer, essentially. And like, because in some ways, I feel like they might even consider it to be worse, because it's a part of an identity, whereas murder is something that is an action that you could like confess and repent of. And I grew up hearing that every, like 3 times a week at least. And I mean, that's not even to, my family was heavily involved and we were almost doing things with the church every day and traveling a lot around to these conferences where we would be listening to sermons all day long, and people would be talking about the sin of homosexuality, about the immorality of like gay marriage and, any human rights being given to LGBTQ people constantly. It took me years, and I feel like at this point I just am like, sexuality is fluid and dynamic. I am not even trying to like have a label because I'm still getting to know myself. It's taken me years to be able to know what it is. Like at this point, I think I would loosely describe myself as like pansexual and my gender as non-binary, but I've gone under different labels at other times because it has taken years to even uncover who I am, because of all of the indoctrination and like coercion that I experienced. And growing up, I always I never really understood why there was such a fixation on gay people. And I never really agreed with it, actually. Even when I was in, I felt like I was still like very devout, I always thought, like, I always kind of felt sorry for queer people and was like, why is the church picking on them? Like, that doesn't really seem right. And it doesn't make sense for people to be created in a certain way and then be told that something that they are is an abomination. Like, that always felt contradictory to me. And so I know that there's been a lot of trauma from, like, of other, like, people who are queer or people who have gender, who are gender nonconforming or trans, who grew up, and who, particularly people who are born and raised in the church, because that is what you are being taught over and over and over again, even as you're trying to understand your own identity and desires.
And the whole thing around sex education and taking kids out of classes when they may be taught sex education, and the lack of and I've spoken about this in another episode, but the lack of sex education and relationship education means that at this age where you are kind of learning who you are and maybe trying to, you know, not just kind of going with the flow and not trying to find what label fits, because maybe that's just an impossible thing to do. And I don't think that that's necessarily even a bad thing. It like, you maybe don't even, at this point, people might not even understand their own bodies and how things feel and how things work, because you're so taught not to, you know, to explore those things or touch yourself or understand yourself, because then it's sinful, even if it's just like, yes, I don't know, check for lumps and things like that.
Yeah.
So there must be so many people out there who are not only trying to navigate their orientation, sexual orientation, and what they feel comfortable with, but also just learning them, you know, who they are and themselves and how their body works and how their body feels. And that must also be quite a significant journey to go on personally with yourself.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, this isn't unique to the Church of Christ either. This is something that is a problem in all of, like, you know, Southern evangelical Christianity. Very, very similar. I remember being given books that were, you know, books like I Kiss Dating Goodbye, you know, things that were about purity culture that other evangelical young people were reading in other churches. So there wasn't, as much as the Church of Christ, like, the rhetoric is that they're set apart and they're different, they actually weren't that different. And this is a problem that is a cultural problem in the US, and I just expect in, like, Western countries that have tended to be more Christian. Or, I mean, probably not just those, but in my experience, from what I know, since I haven't, you know, been everywhere, but it is incredibly damaging, and it is really, it takes a lot of courage, even after leaving, to explore one's gender and sexuality. I am so grateful for my queer and trans people of color community. I feel like in the moments when I had no support network, those are the people who showed up for me and who have, you know, helped me be housed, who have connected me with, you know, because of all of the brainwashing and the trauma, I had experiences of being very disconnected from my body, which has led to illness and me getting sick, and frequently, like, not even realizing that I was sick. I had an experience in Seattle when I lived there of collapsing on the sidewalk outside of my workplace.
Oh,
and I was clearly not well, but I was because I was taught that the body is evil, you know, and that the body is, it's like, as a person in a assigned female earth body, like, your body is a temptation. It is, if men lust, it's because something's wrong with my body. I'm not adorning it properly. It's because my body is inherently sinful and is inherently a temptation. And men are encouraged to blame women for, first of all, you can't stop your thoughts. That's actually not possible. And so as a result, like, women and people, it's hard. I'm using binary gender because in this group, that is the only gender that's acknowledged. But I carried a lot of that kind of suspicion, like the habit of people like casting suspicion on me as somebody who's like, attractive, who I am not at all submissive. I'm not sure if you can tell. And so as far as like what is considered feminine and acceptable for like a woman in the Church of Christ, I did not fit that, and had a lot of anxiety about that growing up, and so became very disconnected from my body. And as a result, that has manifested in chronic illnesses. And I know I'm not the only one to have experienced that. So it has been a journey, even in that sense of just like becoming consciously connected to my body, so that I know when I'm sick and when I'm injured and when something's wrong, and learning to pay attention and to be able to ask for support, and to not feel like that's weakness, that actually interdependence is my value. I believe independence is a myth. There's no organism, species, plant in our ecosystem that is independent, that is just out here living on their own without being completely connected to every other species in the ecosystem. And humans have this mythology around independence, I think especially Americans, and it's not actually true. And that is magnified in groups like this because of the nationalism, and it has a cascade effect to lots of different things that can cause harm for people long term. So that's something that is an ongoing thing for me that I'm like working on, being like not dissociating. Part of that also is connected to, I'll, briefly mention, I had a lot of like repressed memories of abuse that I experienced in childhood that I feel like is condoned and covered up within the Church of Christ. And I know I'm not. I've spoken to other people who are born and raised in the group, and in the past couple of years, I have felt it's felt imperative for me to work on healing that, because it has been affecting my health, and I would notice that I would dissociate and, not know that I have, injured myself, or, and that it would be affecting my mental health, to the point that I became incapacitated and couldn't work for an extended period of time. And I feel really grateful that I was able to come across somatics, that I have a wonderful community of like queer people of color who have supported me across the country, and who have done, I think, what the Church of Christ in some ways, in some ways they do well as far as like supporting each other within the group. But my feeling is that this should just be how society operates in general, that we should like give a damn about people, whether or not they believe the same thing as you, and that we should care about the well-being of the planet, and realize that we are all interdependent and connected. And so those kind of the ways that I saw that practice within the group, some of it was really beautiful. There was this woman at one of the congregations who she potty trained at least half the kids in the congregation, because she was just really good at it. And so parents had support like that when they were having trouble potty training their kids, you know, and that's not something that just exists in the larger community. And so it is something that when you leave, you're like, wow, like I missed that. Or like, you know, if someone lost their job, knowing that like people would make sure they didn't become homeless, or if you're sick, to know that people would bring food. All of these things are things I want to hold on to. I don't want to get rid of those things, but I just want to expand it and have it be more than just like this narrow group of people.
And unconditional as well, conditional upon your status as a church member or your status within the LGBTQIA plus community, all of those things, which, you know, just to make it non-conditional, support for everybody, support for just human beings and life in general.
Right. I'm like, this is how, there's a quote that I feel like perfectly sums up my feelings about it. And I do pull from my experience. I think it's really important for me in my deconstruction process not to just like throw out everything that I learned. Part of the reason that I'm an activist is because this is how I was raised, and I was reading these texts and seeing like Jesus flipping over tables in the temple because they were exploiting the poor, and me thinking like, yeah, like you should,
Jesus.
Yeah, like, you know, this is wrong, and we shouldn't be exploiting people. And whether that was actually practiced, you know, in the group, what that, you know, I would say that probably wasn't. But there's this quote by Adrienne Ree Brown. I actually have it like taped above my desk, and it says, "I have a vision of movement as sanctuary, not a tiny perfectionist utopia behind miles of barbed wire and fences and test and judgment and righteousness, but a vast sanctuary where our experiences as humans who have experienced and caused harm are met with centered, grounded invitations to grow, where winning is measured not just by the absence of patterns of harm, distrust, and isolation, but by the presence of healing and healthy interdependence, where we are skilled at being honest, setting and honoring boundaries, giving and receiving apologies, asking for help, and changing behaviors." And that's from her book, Adrienne Ree Brown's book, We Will Not Cancel Us. And it's written, you know, kind of in response to cancel culture of like, when people do something wrong and they mess up, you just cancel them. And I don't support cancel culture in that way. And as an activist, I'm like, we have to be able to change and grow and allow people to make mistakes and to learn how to repair relationships. And that wasn't something that I learned in this group, but the kind of devotion to community is something that that is still a value, and that I want to, perhaps even in a peer support type of network, to be able to create and build with other folks, because our world needs it. It's something that's lacking in the larger society, which is why groups like this are appealing and why people don't leave them in large part.
To me, everything you've said there just sounds so perfect. And when people speak to me about the promise of a utopia or the promise of a better life, everything that you have said there would be enough to lull me into a high demand group or cult, because that sounds idealistic and perfect to me. And then I think to myself, how can there be people in this world that just don't want the best for everybody else? How are there people that, and everybody I speak to that comes and sits down with me and has these lengthy chats, we all share the same views and values. So I feel like there is definitely a common thread amongst advocates, allies, survivors, and people involved in these movements that just we all share the same traits, I think, that must make us vulnerable to these types of groups and exploitation and coercion. Because
maybe, but I think these are just human.
Just see the best.
I think they're human needs. I really do, and I don't think there's anything that's pathological about wanting the best for people. I certainly would be suspicious if a group came to me and they're like, "This is what we're doing. We figured it out." Like, one of the things that I love about Adrienne Maree Brown and like the emergent strategy community, that's kind of like the group of people. It's not a group. It's just like people. She wrote a book and it's like incredible. And I recommend it. But people who like that book and people who enjoy like Octavia Butler's literature, her sci-fi, people who enjoy things like Ursula Le Guin, people who enjoy things like generative fiction, and envisioning the world in a better situation than we have it right now. I think there are people who join groups like this because they believe that a group has figured it out. What I know after having been a part of a group like this is that no one has figured it out, because if they had, our world would look like a very different place, and that there are systems of oppression that are set up to prevent that ever from actually happening. And so if we do create, I think it's something that will emerge out of necessity, because things become unbearable. And that is why I left, because, there are a lot of benefits to being in this group. I would have never been homeless. I probably would have always had access to healthcare. The reason I left is because things became unbearable. And I think, at least as an activist, the larger society won't feel a compulsion to change and shift in these ways that we're talking about until it becomes unbearable. But there are small groups of us, especially, I think, survivors of cults, who have maybe seen a little glimpse of what things could be like, but seen it done really poorly and harmfully, that are like, something about this, they were onto something. It was done horribly, and it was incredibly traumatizing. And there is a legitimate human need for belonging and for cooperation and for collaboration and for healing and for support. Yeah, and community, that these groups tap into that desire and then manipulate it for something that's harmful. But the desire itself is not a problem. The desire itself is actually how humans have survived for millions of years, because we did learn how to collaborate and we did learn how to work together. Humans are not like, lions or like ferocious sort of predators. And the way that we survived was by collaborating and working together. And recently, I feel like in human history, we've forgotten that. And that's what makes these groups so dangerous, because there's a part of us that knows that that's what we need to survive. And I think these groups do a really good job. Groups like the Church of Christ and other groups that are coercive and authoritarian do a really good job of tapping into that instinct to cooperate and using it in a way that causes harm and traumatizes people and destroys families.
I am really looking forward to your ICSA talk. I think it's going to be incredible. If it's anything like what you said today, it's going to offer so much insight into some just much needed subject matter. And I think that there's nobody better to speak about it from what you said today. And I know that we've missed out a lot. There's a lot that we haven't spoken about, but I feel like some of the other topics have kind of taken priority, and there's been a need to have those lengthy discussions, especially for potential listeners who may want to take parts of this conversation away and apply it to themselves in any way that they can. But one thing I did want to focus on before I ask you if there's anything you think we've missed, and to talk a little bit about your journey out of the group and advice you have for others, is so at the baptism and during the 5 steps that people must follow, they are asked or told that they must repent publicly of any of their sins. And I feel like this almost lines up with some of the HIPAA violations that you spoke about in our communication. So obviously, a lot of the time when we've spoken on the show, when people are told to publicly out themselves for things that they have done, which goes against doctrine or against principles and practices, it's often used as a method of control against somebody, collateral to keep them from leaving the group, a control method to make them feel ashamed and judged by the rest of the group, and all of these nefarious, horrible things that come with the practice of publicly shaming somebody. But then there are actual cases that you know of within the Church of Christ where people's personal information has actually been made available in ways that it shouldn't have been, violating some of their personal information. And I wondered if you could just talk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah. So when I was at Freed-Hardeman University, one of the first things that I did when I went there was go to the counseling office because I knew that I needed support. Like I had been having mental health, like I've been having panic attacks, and I had not been allowed to access mental health support growing up. Like I did ask, but I was told, basically it was against, my parents weren't in support of that. And where you're just told that depression and anxiety is like a demonic attack or like not having enough faith or whatever. So I went to the counseling office and I had one conversation. I don't even know if this person was a licensed therapist, but it was the person who was the director of the counseling office on campus. So the person that you needed to talk to in order to get any sort of counseling services. And I had one conversation with her. And the next thing I know, it may have been a week or two after that conversation that I had shared, that I was struggling with some doubt, that I was feeling depressed, understandably because of, some of the things that I've shared that I experienced. Absolutely. And the next thing I know, my parents are at the school and they are there to take me home, to take me out of school. And I had no idea. I was completely blindsided. They didn't tell me that they were coming. They drove 14 hours to the campus because that's how far away my childhood, the place where I grew up, was from the school. And I didn't go with them. But what I later found out was that after I talked to the person who was head of the counseling office, she called the head of the honors college, who I was in the honors college at that school, and he called my parents, and she had called him and told him everything that I said. And then he called my parents and told them everything I said, and I guess had recommended that they come. And I don't think he had recommended they come take me out of school, but that was what my parents took away from it. And I know of at least 2 other people who that happened to. Thankfully for me, it was just the one session. But that not only violated HIPAA, but also FERPA, which is like the federal law that protects education privacy and confidentiality. It's a law that says that, if you're in college, your parents can't call and just get your grades or find out anything about your school unless you've given consent. And I had not given consent. These other people hadn't given consent. And one of the people that I knew, it was going on for so long, she was seeing the same counselor, and the counselor would call after every single session and tell her parents everything that she said. Goodness. Yeah. And she didn't know for months.
That is such an awful violation.
Yeah, huge violation of privacy, betrayal, and breaking of the law.
Absolutely.
As well.
And also, as you said, that left a bad taste in your mouth, and it took you a while to decide to try speaking to a professional again, or I would say professional in air quotes, because that person has obviously not acted in a professional capacity whatsoever.
Right.
But you ended up in such a bad place that you were almost forced into going to find somebody that could help you find a way to manage the situation that you were in. And perhaps you may not have had to go back to that place or to even enter that difficult period had you not been scared away from speaking to somebody in that capacity in the first place.
Right.
And on top of that, I'm pretty sure it's compulsory or mandatory for a lot of further education bodies to have a service that provides some type of well-being support, like the counselling services you've mentioned. So if that was not a mandatory part of education in some parts of the world, it doesn't even sound like it would exist in that particular college that you're talking about, because they obviously don't take it seriously enough to treat it with any kind of respect.
No, I think it was more like a surveillance mechanism more so than
absolutely.
It was. Yeah, it wasn't meant to be therapeutic or like helpful.
That is just, there's so many things that we've talked about that we've talked about today that are so problematic with this movement. And of course, things may have changed since you were there. And I really do hope that they have, because it's difficult to sit here and think about other people that may be going through the same experiences, whether they are struggling with their identity in terms of sexuality or gender, whether they are struggling with their identity culturally and because of their heritage and the color of their skin, whether people are struggling because of mental health. And as you've talked about, the Church of Christ just doesn't believe in science. People being denied mainstream education or some kind of structural education. There are so many things that we've spoken about that are important to highlight and to discuss and to bring to the attention of other people. And I do hope that things have progressed and changed, because it's quite scary to think about people experiencing these things. But also, as we've said time and time again throughout this entire interview, the Church of Christ really isn't unique in its principles and practices to the larger picture. There may be a few things that they do differently that sets them aside from other movements, but overall, generally, they are not doing things that have never been explored before or never been heard of before. So there must be millions of people following these practices of these captive organizations and high demand faiths that are experiencing all of the things that we have discussed today. And that to me is just overwhelming. Like, where do you even begin to help or change or I don't know. It's just and a lot of these people won't even have access to any kind of information that could teach them that things are different or things can be different, or that their faith is exactly the same as the other denomination that's existing 2 blocks away. And it's overwhelming when you think about it. But
one of the good things recently that has come out of the COVID situation is, and this is not just true for the Church of Christ, but the lockdowns gave people a break from the constant indoctrination. And the Church of Christ has been hemorrhaging members since the lockdown started. And I can't say I'm unhappy to hear that. There has been, at least like on the Reddit group, an influx of people who stopped going during lockdown, had a moment to be like, wait, what am I like? Do I want to keep being a part of this group? And then chose not to go back. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're deconstructing, in the sense that they're questioning all of the beliefs, but it has given people some breathing room. And then there's also the internet, which, for most of my life that we've discussed up till now, like of course, as an adult, there was the internet, but growing up, I didn't necessarily have access to like Google or whatever. And so now I am hopeful that because there is internet and social media and podcasts like this, and these docuseries that exist, those were super helpful actually for me, listening to other people's stories and hearing how similar their experiences were to mine, for me to start thinking like, I think this is true. This person who told me I was in a cult, I think they're right, and so I feel hopeful about that, at least.
And I suppose this is a good opportunity for me to ask before we move on to the last questions. But for me, who is a white person, what is the correct terminology for me to use when speaking about the community groups that include people of color? Is that the right way to word it? What is the most appropriate way to address and speak about community groups, so that I can make sure I am adopting all of those things in further interviews?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. I think it kind of depends on the person. So my inclination is to ask, especially if the person is a person of color, Black, like brown, immigrant of color, to ask them how they refer to themselves, or how they would like to be called. There are so many different terms, and people can feel sensitive about how they are referred to. And so for me, I tend to use the term bodies of color, because it is ultimately our bodies that people are responding to. And, our bodies are what is being discriminated against. It doesn't really have anything to do with our culture, because most of the time when we're experiencing some sort of like othering or discrimination, people haven't even gotten the chance to know us. And, our cultures are not monolithic. I consider myself very Southern, but not every Black person in the United States is Southern. There are people who grew up in other parts of the country. So that would be I mean, that's how I've moved through spaces. And, I certainly don't know everything. I know a lot about my own experience, but, one of the things that I have experienced is feeling a really deep kinship with people who are refugees and asylees to the U.S., because they have had the experience of leaving their life behind and having to reconstruct a new life. And I found that just even without trying or without intending to, a lot of them, I have a lot of friends who are refugees and immigrants, and I've learned a lot from them, and I've had to be corrected about, how I refer to them, or like biases that I have been taught. And so the biggest thing is just being open and knowing that no one knows everything, and we're all works in progress and learning, and just like being willing to like hear what other people desire, like what works for them as far as how they would like to be referred to. And that goes for gender and sexuality and all of those other kinds of identity as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for clearing that up. It's always a difficult thing to navigate, wanting to be person-centered and ensuring that every person's treated as an individual. But of course, the ways that we are brought up and the cultures that we grow up in are always going to play a part in the way that we categorize people and group people together and stop seeing people as individuals. So I just wanted to ask about that. And just to ask people how they would like to be referred to, if a label needs to be applied at all, which might not always be the case, then to just ask them, and the person will tell you. So that's great. Thank you for that. So my last question for you this evening, even though, as I said, there's like a whole load of things to even go over, and is to ask you what advice you would have for other people who are also in high demand religious groups or thinking about leaving or have left. What advice you would have for them in their own healing journeys, and what they can do to empower themselves, to increase their interdependence, and to navigate life outside of a captive organization.
That is such a loaded question. I in reflecting on this, which I have done a lot because my entire family is still in the group. I don't know if I said that, and I'm no contact with my family, so I don't go back for funerals, weddings, births, any of that sort of thing. So for folks who might be in the non-institutional Church of Christ or the Church of Christ or any group like that, my best advice is to question everything. And this is definitely speaking from my experience. I know it sounds terrifying to question everything because I went through it. And I remember I was in college and was sharing with a friend that I was having some doubts and I had a lot of questions. And I even remember growing up, I got kicked out of Sunday school a couple of times for asking too many questions.
That doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me.
It sounds very me. And that friend said to me after I expressed, doubts and having questions, they were like, don't think about it too much. You might think yourself out of your faith. And that surprised me so much because I just remember feeling like I don't want to have a faith that's so fragile I can't think about it. I can't build a life on something that flimsy. And sometimes questions do lead to more questions. But that's like a part of the adventure of life. And at least me, I desire to live my life deeply and authentically and vulnerably, and to live my life in connection with other people and with the earth. And in order to do that, I have to ask questions, and I have to be open to whatever answers emerge. And I have to be willing to sit with discomfort as well. And be willing to admit that I don't know, that sometimes there isn't a clear answer. And I think that is one of the most challenging things. And if you have especially been born and raised in a group like this, is that they present everything as like very black and white, as like everything being certain. And it's hard, even it can feel terrifying to admit that you don't know. But I've never regretted asking questions before, and I wouldn't trade that false certainty that I had in the Church of Christ ever for the freedom and the self-knowledge, the deep self-knowledge that I have now. And I guess if people are on that journey, or they're looking to start the journey, to, start asking questions, and just to know that you're in good company, of many people before you and alongside you who are also asking these questions and sitting with discomfort and healing from having had the wrong answer to these questions at some point in the past and having experienced harm from that. So yeah, that's what I would say. And I even will say, like, if folks have questions like that and they want to have conversations, especially folks who are from the Churches of Christ, and especially if they're like people of color and queer people, like, I love having conversations like this. I love questions. It's really my jam. And I enjoy supporting people and like holding space for really big questions that sometimes can feel too big to hold by yourself. So folks can feel free to reach out to me.
Absolutely. If anybody would like Evvie's email address or to reach out, then you can get in touch with me, and I will then email Evvie, reach out to them, and we can connect people together. So get in touch, and thank you so much for everything that you've talked about with us today. Thank you for giving us insight into your experiences, especially because they have been so raw and vulnerable and connected to you as a person and an individual, and an overview of the religion and the movement itself as well, and how it may be impacting other individuals. And I feel like that is the greatest thing that we can do on this show: give an overview of the entire movement, but also then narrow it down to personal experiences that people haven't actually lived through, because then it's real. It's not just me reading off some facts about the start date of a church and some of the things that they believe in. You know, these are things that have actually happened, may still be happening to other people. And of course, we've highlighted some things that are of extreme importance around marginalized community groups, not just within faith-based movements, but in the world in general. These marginalized community groups that exist all around us every day, that may be more susceptible to exploitation and coercion because they are living on the fringes. And I feel like that's so important to look at and to discuss as well. And I cannot wait for your ICSA talk. It's in June, is that right?
I think it's in July. It's either June or July. It's in the summer.
But as soon as there is a link for the event, I will share it so everybody can tune in if they would like to watch it, with the International Cultic Studies Association. Very important work that they do at the ICSA conferences, and the research and people that they have attending the conference. And as I said before, I think you're an absolutely perfect candidate to go and speak about the bodies of color in the cult survivor space, and I really, really look forward to it. So thank you so much, Evvie, for your time today, and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You as
Thank
well.
you, Evvie. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.